The Nintendo Switch OLED model has arrived. After months of speculation about an upgraded Switch, we're finally going to take a comprehensive look at the OLED model here in this episode, complete with a teardown of the unit. The Switch OLED retails for $350 and it does come with some improvements, notably the OLED panel that is simply stunning, and certainly an improvement over the previous LCD IPS panel, as well as the dock has had some tweaks as well. But for $350 is it worth the money to upgrade, especially if you own a Switch or even a Switch Lite? Well, I've spent 4 days with the OLED model and really put the system through its paces. So with that, let's take a closer look. The first thing that you'll notice is the OLED screen. The increased 7-inch screen size is a welcome addition, and the OLED panel itself absolutely pops with its vibrant colors and deep blacks, especially when compared to the older 6.2 IPS LCD panel that's found in the existing Nintendo Switch line. The OLED display looks superb, with each individual pixel illuminated as compared to the backlight that's required for the LCD panel. Now, I did a few comparisons with the OLED panel against the older IPS panel, and at a glance, it doesn't appear to be much of a difference. But the beauty of OLED is how it handles darker colors. Taking a look at the Metroid Dread introduction sequence side by side, the IPS panel holds up pretty well. But take note of the background. There's quite a bit that's missing compared to the OLED display. But perhaps an even better illustration of how great the OLED panel is, if we take a look at Tetris Effect Connected. You can clearly see the backlighting on the IPS panel, and it really makes a big difference to the overall visual fidelity of the OLED. It's the clear winner. But I do want to stress, it's not that the older IPS panel is bad, it certainly looks very clean, especially the smaller Switch Lite panel, but the OLED really does shine. Now, speaking of OLED, the Nintendo Switch is certainly not the first handheld to feature an OLED panel. That accolade belongs to the PlayStation Vita all the way back to 2012, and the Vita display was absolutely incredible in 2012. But how does it hold up against the Nintendo Switch? Well, for this, I wanted to compare a game that runs on both platforms side by side, and I opted for Final Fantasy X HD Remaster, and the comparison is really close. The Vita still holds up very well in 2021. But it's fair to say that the OLED panel on the Switch is just a little bit better overall, with a slightly richer and vibrant display. Still, for 2012, the Vita is no slouch. But one area where the OLED panel on the PlayStation Vita suffered over time was burn-in. It's too early to say if the Switch OLED model will suffer from the same fate, but it is a byproduct of an OLED display, so we will need to wait and see if and when this may become an issue. If there are indeed reports of burn-in on the OLED Switch over time, or if it's something that I experience, I'll definitely be reporting back with some updated information. Now, a couple of final words about the OLED display before we move on. It's excellent in all viewing angles, and it really does pop. Up close, you can really get a sense of how clean the image looks. But I want to be clear that if you own a Switch, particularly a Switch Lite, you're still going to get a great image from that IPS panel. They certainly hold up very well. Another area where the OLED display really shines is on older retro releases. Take a look at Shantae for the Nintendo Switch, it looks really great. And I might add that this game does not rely on the borders to fill out the 16:9 display, and this is the preferred option when it comes to an OLED panel. Unfortunately, if we take a look at games on the Nintendo Switch Online service, the border is fixed, and it would be really cool if there was an update to disable them. Now, we can talk about how great the OLED is for another hour, but you get the point. It's the main draw of the system, and it does everything as advertised. But let's move on. The OLED model comes complete with an upgraded dock that's firmware updatable, and it also comes with wide Ethernet built in. Now, this is a little disappointing. When I ran some speed tests on wide Ethernet, I was getting roughly 75 megabytes per second down and about 35 megabytes per second up. Now, keep in mind, I'm running a fiber internet connection with 1000 up and 1000 down. This is a lot less than I had anticipated. I then switched back to good old Wi-Fi, and I was getting roughly the same results. In fact, in some instances, I was getting faster speeds on Wi-Fi than I was getting on wide Ethernet. Unfortunately, when performing network speed tests on the wired Ethernet connection, I'm not getting anywhere close to acceptable speeds. And when I inquired about this on Twitter, I got many reports of other users having similar speeds. So what's actually going on here? Well, the first thing to keep in mind, even though it is wired Ethernet, because the Nintendo Switch is connected to the dock via USB-C, it's effectively sharing its bandwidth with display data, audio data, and of course power. So it takes less of a priority. After all, there's only so much USB-C bandwidth to go around. But what's even worse, even though the Switch does support USB 3.0, it's actually disabled in the dock and it's falling back to utilize the USB 2.0 protocol, which has an upper theoretical limit of 480 megabytes per second. Now keep in mind, we are not getting anywhere close to that number. So what I did was adjust my MTU to 1500 as suggested by a few guides, and the results didn't change much, if any at all. But it's not just the dock, we also need to keep in mind that these network speeds are also likely determined by Nintendo's servers that the Switch is connecting to. So this isn't necessarily a dig at one thing wrong with the dock, it's more of a criticism around a $350 premium product. The network speeds are absolutely atrocious, and in many use cases, it's probably just better to go back to Wi-Fi, because it doesn't rely on USB at all. It's downloading directly to the device. Now, while wired Ethernet will certainly help with a stable flow of packets and help with latency, and will be very good for online gaming, it's very disappointing otherwise. For example, if you own an exclusive digital Switch library and you want to download games on your OLED Switch, prepare to wait many hours for your games to be downloaded. As an example, I downloaded Final Fantasy X HD Remaster, which was a 27GB download, and it took about 4.5 hours to pull down. This, quite frankly, is unacceptable speeds in 2021. I did expect much better than this. But moving on, there's been many reports about a 4K chip that's found in the dock, a Realtek RTD 2172N. So I decided to open up the dock and take a look for myself, and indeed, the Realtek RTD chip is present in all its glory. Now, while the dock is capable of upscaling to 4K, there is no evidence to suggest that the current Switch models will ever support them, at least in firmware. And this is where we start to speculate. Maybe Nintendo is getting ahead of the curve by updating the dock for a future revision of the hardware. But that also seems unlikely given reports of a new SoC and DLSS as a standard feature. So then my takeaway is, although the dock is capable of upscaling to 4K, I don't think it's particularly interesting, at least at this time. Now we know that the Tegra X1 is also capable of 4K as well, but the Switch simply lacks the power to run games at 4K. So we then must turn to what's obvious. And it's simply a matter of cost and availability. The earlier HDMI 1.4 controllers are outdated and harder to source. HDMI 2.0, as found in this Switch dock, is commonly available, cheaper, and with the chip shortage, was probably the preferred option. As for the Switch itself, it comes with other notable changes. First is the kickstand. It's been replaced by one that's almost as wide as the system itself, and it's quite sturdy, and it will definitely not come apart in your hand. If you've ever used a Surface tablet or something similar, then you'll absolutely fall in love with the new kickstand. It also has a quite large angle radius that can be adjusted, and this is a very nice addition. I can't tell you how many times the original kickstand would just come off. Now, one particular feature of the new OLED Switch is the placement of the SD card slot. It's underneath the kickstand like it was in the older Switch model, but when you lift up the kickstand flap, you can see the SD card slot on the left-hand side. Now, the problem is that the SD card slot is really kind of nestled in there, and it's very difficult sometimes to remove the SD card out of the system. The only real way that I can do it pretty much every time is to lay the Switch flat on its face. And of course, depending on, what surface you're putting it on, you don't want to damage that OLED screen, but removing the card can be a little tedious at times. It's definitely not impossible, and I heard some people on Twitter being unhappy about the way that the SD card slot has been implemented in the OLED model, but it is a lot more tedious than it should be. In the older Switch model, it was a lot simpler to do. Another new addition is the increase to 64GB of flash, double of the original 32GB on the Switch and Switch Lite. Again, another welcome addition indeed. This means more internal space before you need to resort to an SD card. But given the price of SD cards these days, the increased flash does seem a little unnecessary. Perhaps the cost could have been applied in another area. Okay, so let's get on to the topic of Joy-Cons and the dreaded Joy-Con drift, and this is another issue that we'll need to wait and see on. Nintendo published an interview to coincide with the launch of the OLED model, with Nintendo engineers Ko Shioda and Toru Yamashita discussing invisible improvements to Joy-Con design to improve durability, and they specifically mention utilizing improved parts to mitigate the issue, but they also admitted that Joy-Con wear over time was unavoidable. So then, if we open up a Joy-Con to get a closer look, it looks to be identical to a standard Switch Joy-Con, with no new parts or design changes. The parts themselves are different, and perhaps this is what Yamashita-san was referring to, but to answer the question, will we see Joy-Con drift in the new OLED Switch, it's tough to gauge. Given that there are no design changes, only different parts, it feels like the problem will occur once again. But just as with the OLED burn-in, we will need to wait and see and keep an eye on reports coming in about this one. If you are experiencing drift on the OLED model, please let me know in the comments below. So far, I've yet to experience any, and hopefully it'll stay that way for a long time to come. So of course, we need to tear down the system and take a look at the internals. Now, if you've ever taken apart a Switch before, somehow this model is even easier to open up than the Switch Lite or the earlier model. The only main difference is that there are two screws when you lift up the kickstand flap on either side, but once you remove the back panel, it's pretty much the same teardown as before. As far as the main board, it's largely underwhelming. Removing the heatsink and metal shroud reveals the SoC and flash memory chips. The SoC is the exact same Marico revision chipset from the Switch Lite and the Redbox Switch. The flash memory, of course, has been updated, but essentially everything else is the same. Of course, there's the OLED panel, which is different from the IPS panel previously, and the placement of the SD slot is different. But there's probably no reason at all to ever tear down a Switch OLED unless you want to replace thermal paste or replace the fans. Incidentally, before someone asks, there is no way to mod this device for Homebrew, and it's unknown if that will ever happen in future. And that is really about it. Once you've been wowed by the gorgeous OLED display, there's nothing really different about this OLED model Switch. So after 4 days, I've had a really good look at the Nintendo Switch OLED model, and while I'm very impressed, especially when it comes to the OLED display, I do have a few things that I want to say. If you're coming into the Switch ecosystem for the first time and you're looking to buy a Nintendo Switch, then undoubtedly the OLED model is the one that you want to buy. It offers the best features, it has these premium features, and it really will give you the best experience, whether that be in handheld mode where it really does excel, or even in docked mode, which is still a great experience. But if you are an existing Switch owner, maybe you own a Switch Lite or a Redbox Switch or an older base model Switch, and you are thinking about upgrading to the OLED model, apart from the OLED display, is it really worth $50 extra or $350 if you're just doing a full upgrade? Well, the answer to that is, I don't really think so. I don't really think that the OLED screen by itself is enough to warrant a upgrade if you own an existing Switch, because at the end of the day, you're going to get the exact same experience overall. And while yes, the screen does look really, really nice, undoubtedly, the experience of playing these Switch games is going to be the exact same experience from one Switch to the other. There's nothing new here. There's no new performance features, and it's something that we'll have to wait and see on if Nintendo decides to upgrade in the coming years. We've heard a lot of rumors about a enhanced Switch model, and we'll just have to wait and see if that does come to fruition. But they are just my thoughts and opinions on the Nintendo Switch OLED. I still love the product. I think it's awesome. The screen really is the star of the show here, but other than that, you're not really going to get anything compelling as far as new features to make it an essential purchase, in my opinion, if you're already a existing Switch owner. But that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to put a like on it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.